Welcome to the Weekly Takeaway, what you need to know from the news. Several stories this week, including how bad is the government at counting? And based on their bad counting, how much are they willing to overreach into our lives? These are big stories. We'll talk briefly about Bernie Sanders, probably the last time we'll talk about Bernie Sanders, as well as some unexpected side effects of the quarantine. Turns out even the Easter Bunny has been impacted by COVID-19. All of these stories, and we'll jump right in with our top story today. COVID-19 projections, and you may be aware of this, have been reduced by 35%. Now, if you remember, it wasn't that long ago, we were talking about mass deaths across the United States. Numbers as large as 2.5 million, some even, depending on who you're talking to, close to 3 million people. And we assume that these numbers were right because experts are always right. It turns out scientists aren't very good at math. They have models that project exactly how many people will be killed from a virus that they cannot define, they cannot contain, they don't know where it came from or how they're going to deal with it, but they can tell us exactly how many people are going to die. Turns out they were wrong. And in order to look as though they're right, they continue to adjust their predictions. They've reduced their numbers down to 60,000. I would imagine that will continue to go down. There are so many good takeaways from this. And I'm afraid on one hand that what we'll take away is that anytime the experts tell us something, they're wrong, and so we won't respond. That's probably the wrong takeaway. But one of the big takeaways, and perhaps the most important, is that models, not just in healthcare predictions, but throughout life, models are only as good as the assumptions they use. They're only as good as the assumptions they use. And if you are using a wrong assumption and you plug that into a modeling tool, you will come up with the wrong conclusions. And certainly the government has done that. Now, there are huge implications to this. Remember that much of what we're dealing with right now in this process of quarantine is based on the modeling of these professionals. One story, and this is our next story today that illustrates well where this can take us, potentially in a bad way, is that of Liberty University. Liberty University, a Christian university, the largest Christian university in the world, recently issued an arrest warrant by campus police for a New York Times reporter who was trespassing on their property. The Washington Post and the New York Times have consistently reported on Liberty University throughout this time of quarantine and painting a picture that the university, does not care about either the government or regulations or their students, which is crazy when you're talking about the largest Christian university in the world. But this all comes on the heels of quarantines that have been put in place because of bad modeling, which again leads us to the question, how much authority does the government, the national government or our local governments, how much authority do they have based on their own projections and modeling, which so often are wrong, as is the case right now, to reach into our lives and control our behavior? Many colleges across the country have closed or gone to an online system because of everything that's happening from the healthcare front, trying to protect their students. Liberty University has done that in part, but in other places have not. But they have said, and I believe they are, doing the very best they can to protect their students. There is nothing to gain by them hurting the people who pay their tuition. They're doing the very best that they can. And yet again, a clear illustration that if we're not careful, based on bad information and bad numbers, we can allow the government to control our lives. I'm not sure how all of this will turn out, but I do know on the other side of everything that's going on right now, we are going to have to take a serious look at just how much authority under the guise of healthcare has over our lives. And in other news, Bernie Sanders. You're familiar with Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders this week dropped out of the race to become the next president of the United States, giving way to Vice President Biden. This is an interesting development. This is one that we thought was coming, but one that seems a bit out of place. These two candidates, very different in their perspective on the world, represent two very different groups. Most believe that Joe Biden has very little chance of defeating President Trump in a general election, that Bernie Sanders had a better chance, a better opportunity, and certainly would have been a better candidate, and yet he pulled out. And the question most of us don't have the answer to is, why? What would motivate him to back out at this point in the process of being nominated to be the one who would run against the president? We don't know everything that happens in the back rooms and the deals that are made to make these things happen. We have no idea. But it does beg the question, what's happening to the Democratic Party? Where they, the party, would get behind the least likely candidate to actually defeat a sitting president. We don't know what they're doing or why they're doing it. We don't even clearly understand who they're representing because of the decisions that have been made in this nominating process. But here's the takeaway as we consider Bernie Sanders' last stand, unless he tries to run again in 4 years. We'll see. He's been pretty consistent. As we consider Bernie Sanders' last stand, the takeaway is this. The Democratic Party, when all of this is over, is going to have to step back and decide who it is that they want to represent. And if it's not the people represented by a candidate like Bernie Sanders, will there be a third party? This is such an interesting track to follow because it wasn't that long ago that people were asking of the Republican Party, who do they represent? And if they're not representing everyone, will there be another party? A strong leader, whether you agree with the president or not, stepped into place and really brought the party together. And now it seems the Democratic Party is in a place where they need someone strong to stand up and either bring the party together or fracture it so that they can accurately represent those they say they represent. It will be interesting to see what happens. And as we continue, we know that many things have happened because of the quarantines and this COVID-19 virus that we're dealing with. But there have been some unexpected side effects as well. We learned this week that in New Zealand, the Prime Minister dubbed the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy as, quote, essential workers. This is really an interesting development in this big story. Now, in my home, we have teeth lost all the time because I have small children and they're always putting those teeth under their pillows. Just this week, I told my kids that the Tooth Fairy was not an essential worker. Too bad for them they don't live in New Zealand, because in New Zealand, she is an essential worker. Everyone doing the best to make the best out of a bad situation. And then Zoom blunders. Zoom. You're familiar with Zoom. You probably weren't 3 weeks ago, but you are now, because all business, all meetings, family gatherings, everything is done on Zoom. But unfortunately, not everyone decided to take the training that went along with using the platform. In Italy, a priest during Mass was doing a great job on a Zoom meeting taking care of those that he's supposed to take care of, but he accidentally hit a filter and during Mass put on himself a space helmet. It was entertaining, probably not to him. And in another meeting, Lizette Ocampo, the political director at People for the American Way, also not clear exactly on how to use Zoom, turned herself into a potato. It made the meeting better than it would have been otherwise. A lot of great things going on this week. It's crazy to see just how different things are in so many different places, and we're going to get through this together. But today, the biggest story is a story that is always the biggest story on this day, Easter Sunday. What a day in the middle of this mess to talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And around the world, even though folks can't necessarily gather together as they once did, people of every nation and every nationality and every language are celebrating the resurrection of our Savior. This is an interesting time to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, because what we celebrate when we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus is new birth and new life. We celebrate that there was death, but that because God so loved the world, there was on the other side of that death, life. We celebrate that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, cared enough about mankind to die in His place and to provide a way of salvation so that He could go forward in His life and in His family and in His community so that He could be reconciled to a holy God. What a thing to celebrate on this Easter Sunday. It's easy when we look around and we consider the news. We can look at modeling efforts gone wrong. The fact that the government can't count very well. The fact that even though they can't model or count, they still decide to overreach into our lives and shut an economy down. We consider all that's happening in our political sphere and the things that people are trying to do to adjust to a new world. We consider all of that, and it can be extremely depressing and difficult if we're not careful. But what we celebrate today on Easter Sunday is that even death cannot stop our Savior and our God. And I hope that as you consider this weekend, your big takeaway is this: there is always hope. And we know there's hope because in Israel today there is an empty tomb where once laid God in the flesh, who rose again victorious and finally, once and for all, defeated sin and death. Hope you have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next time.